Chapter 1 of Mounted Police Life in Canada. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mounted Police Life in Canada by Captain Burton Dean. Chapter 1 1883 to 84. Regina. It was a glorious morning in the early part of July, 1883, when I left the Windsor Hotel in Regina and started to walk the 2.5 miles of rolling prairie that intervened between the hotel and the barracks of the North West Mounted Police, some of the roofs of which were distinguishable in the distance. Regina had been selected by Lieutenant Governor Edgar Dewdney as the capital of the North West Territories, and had been christened by Her Royal Highness the Princess Louise, whose husband, the Marquis of Lorne, was then Governor-General of Canada. The Mounted Police had been ordered to make Regina their headquarters, and the transfer from Port Walsh had not been quite completed at the time of which I write. In order to facilitate the housing of the police in their new home, a number of so-called portable buildings had been shipped in from Eastern Canada. These had been made in sections and were readily put together on the spot. Needless to say, they were cold habitations, and every room on the ground floor required to have a stove to itself. The prairie was carpeted with wild roses. For a time I tried to avoid stepping on them, but they were so plentiful that the avoidance of them became irksome, and I hardened my heart and walked on. I found the officer in command to be Superintendent William Herchmer, known all over Prince Rupert's Land as Colonel Billy. Whence he derived his title of Colonel I do not know, but he assumed it, and it stuck to him. I sought him out and reported my arrival, and he took me round and introduced me to the other officers in the post. These were Dr. Jukes, the senior surgeon of the force, Inspector P.R. Neal, the supply officer, and Inspectors A.R. MacDonald, Griesbach, and A.B. Perry. The latter had served a short time in the Royal Engineers at Chatham, but the atmosphere of the School of Military Engineering seemed to have proved uncongenial, and he had returned to his native country to accept a commission in the North West Mounted Police. The Commissioner of the force, Colonel A.G. Irvine, was not in Regina at the time of my arrival, and as he had more room in his quarters than he absolutely required for himself, I was installed therein for the time being. Having with me a folding bedstead which I had used in the Ashanti campaign of 1873-4, and a light kit, I was easily housed until my quarters should be ready for occupation. Inspector Neal was married and comfortably settled, and he and his wife were kind enough to ask me to take my meals with them, which I was very glad to do. The empty shell of a house, a story and a half high, was placed at my disposal, and I was invited to partition it off to suit my convenience, which I did. Carpenters were at once set to work on it, and 2 rooms were added downstairs, which made it a sufficiently commodious and convenient habitation. Seeing that there was no rent to pay, and that the government provided stoves, fuel and light, I considered myself supremely fortunate. After a few days, the Adjutant Superintendent John Cotton arrived, and general orders then announced the appointment as Inspector of R.B. Dean, Esquire, although my credentials from Ottawa showed that I had been a captain in the Imperial service. The Mounted Police Force had been in existence for 10 years, and had not a standing order or regulation of any kind. I was expected to remedy this defect, and as I had been for 5 years adjutant of a division of Royal Marines consisting of 3,500 non-commissioned officers and men, besides officers, and had served afloat and ashore for close on 16 years, it was child's play for me to draft regulations for a little force of 500 men, when once I had become acquainted with the conditions of life and service in the country. Regulations were needed badly enough, but what was more urgently required than anything else was the driving power to compel the wheels of the machine to turn smoothly. I had been told in Ottawa that I should find the Mounted Police an armed mob, and I certainly discovered them to be so. I spent the best part of the months of July and August in Regina, trying to teach the hay leg, straw leg business to some recruits, and when the comptroller visited the post towards the conclusion of that interval, he said that he noticed an improvement in the bearing of the men. At the beginning of September I went to Toronto to fetch my family, who were installed in a house there, and brought them all westward early in the next month, wife, 5 children, and a domestic servant whom we had found in Winnipeg. A telegram from T.C. Patteson to Mr. George Stephen, President of the Canadian Pacific, now Lord Mont Stephen, expedited the transmission of the car containing our household goods, and we soon settled down in our new home and awaited the advent of our first north-west winter. The first line of study that it was incumbent upon me to take up was obviously that of the criminal law. I was familiar with military law, and it was fortunate that I was so, for there was no one in the country, either at the bar or on the bench, who knew anything about it, and it devolved upon me, a few years later, to teach the Supreme Court of the North West Territories the true relations between itself and a court constituted by the Mounted Police Act. The particulars of this will be found under the chapter entitled Mounted Police Law. The study of the criminal law that we were to administer in the country was at that time a little complicated, for only certain statutes were in force in the North West Territories. Having ascertained from Colonel Richardson, the senior stipendiary magistrate, which those were, I was set to work to epitomise them into the form of a manual which a constable could carry about with him, so as to inform himself as occasion might require. Colonel Richardson was very kind, and devoted several hours to going over my work with me, and to making corrections and suggestions. I studied also all the police manuals which I could procure, the principal ones being those of the Royal Irish Constabulary and the Melbourne Force. In this manner I spent the winter of 1883 in equipping myself for my future duties, and the time was well spent. So far as any idea of a constable's manual was concerned, the police department at Ottawa had no interest in nor sympathy with any such project. My manuscript was promptly consigned to a pigeon-hole, where it remained until a sympathetic fire came along some years later and made an end of it, and of other records in the departmental building at Ottawa. I next turned my attention to the problem of standing orders, which were very urgently needed, and with that object in view I studied all the literature that I could procure. I have already remarked that, however desirable regulations might be, it was equally desirable that there should be some driving power which would keep the machine moving, and an illustration of this may be offered. One of the officers stationed at headquarters had been detailed for railway duty, and in pursuance thereof he used to travel on a pass, and to talk mysteriously about the people with whom he used to come in contact, and so on. After I got to know him better, he told me that he did not know what his duties were, and that he had never received any orders on the subject. To my knowledge, he never made a report, and his chief object in life seemed to be to buy scrip cheaply from the half-breeds. He had begun to acquire 1,000 acres of land in Manitoba, and thought of little else. I do not know what good the purchase did for him, for when he died he did not leave a penny. Presumably he bought more land than he could pay taxes on, with the consequence that in time it was sold to cover the arrears. This is an apt and true illustration of the go-as-you-please manner in which the Mounted Police Force ran itself in the year of our Lord 1883. In April 1884 the Commissioner appointed a board of officers, of which I was one, to formulate a single rank drill for the force and to draft standing orders. The drill was soon disposed of, and then glances of inquiry were cast at me. If I asked if there were any means of ascertaining the contents of the Commissioner's office, as there was necessarily therein a certain amount of material which would have to be worked into standing orders, and this ought to be at our disposal, it seemed that there was no way by which we could obtain the required information, and I therefore said that I did not see how we could make any progress. The board died a natural death then and there. The Commissioner, who had been to Ottawa during part of the session, returned on Good Friday and announced that I was to be promoted to superintendent, and appointed adjutant from April 1st. The appointment, however, did not actually reach Regina until May 14th, and on that day I took charge of the Commissioner's office. The staff consisted of Staff Sergeant W. H. Irwin, now Clerk of the District Court at Lethbridge, and Sergeant, now Superintendent, Rutledge. The care and attention which my predecessor had not bestowed upon his office were evident by the fact that there was not even an index to the correspondence, and it was necessary for us to sort and examine the entire contents of the office, and to make a correspondence register as we went along. This gave me the opportunity that I was looking for, of finding out what orders there were for incorporation in my new work, and although the operation exhausted several weeks, the time was not ill spent. The lack of a correspondence register explained some funny little dockets with which the table in the Commissioner's office was covered. These were all neatly folded up, with labels describing their contents, and an India rubber band around each of them. When the office was properly fitted up, I asked the Commissioner if he had any objection to my removing his treasures piecemeal and answering them. There was no very great difficulty in so doing, although I was a stranger to the country. One docket, I remember, related to a claim made by an old widow at Battleford, whose oat crop had been trampled by some police horses which had broken through her fence. I recommended payment of $100 to settle her claim. Another prolific source of correspondence were the numerous claims made by men, when taking their discharge from the force, or compensation on account of having received some injury while in pursuance of duty. One docket related to a claim for $5,000 made by a non-commissioned officer, and it caused us a great deal of trouble to hunt up old ration returns and such like documents to find out where he was on certain given dates. There was nothing on record to show that the so-called injury had ever been reported at the time, and this obviously called for a remedy in the future. In the Royal Navy I knew that when a man was injured on duty he was given what was known as a hurt certificate, and I made provision that, in cases where a man was injured in the force, a board of officers should be immediately convened to take the evidence of the persons cognizant of the facts, and to give an opinion in accordance with that evidence. That settled the question. Another source of acrimonious correspondence was the question of discharge by purchase, which had never been either recognised or in contemplation, for the simple reason that it cost the country so much money to bring men into the West, that the least return the Government could expect was that the men should serve the term of 5 years for which they had engaged. However, so many men claimed that recruiting officers had led them to believe that they could "buy out" if they did not happen to be satisfied, that I introduced a system from my old corps by which applicants for purchase had their names placed on a list, and were allowed to take their turn at the rate of 3 per month. Sir John Macdonald was pleased to approve of this suggestion, and it was adopted in the Mounted Police. The principle involved was all right, but the accession to power of the Borden Government in 1911 it laid itself open to abuse. In the year 1912 no fewer than 50 men were allowed to purchase their discharge out of a force numbering only 654 men. An amendment to the Mounted Police Act was made in the following year, increasing the pay of the various ranks and reducing the term of a constable's engagement from 5 to 3 years. In review of this reduction, I wrote to Mr. R.B. Bennett, MP for Calgary, and advising that discharge by purchase should be abolished except in very special cases. He replied, saying that he agreed with everything I had written, and would take the matter up with the Comptroller. The vigorous manner in which he did so may be gauged by the fact that in that year, 1913, out of a total number of 708 non-commissioned officers and constables, no fewer than 71 had been permitted to purchase their discharge prior to November 1st. Out of the aforesaid total number, 43 men deserted during the same time, and 49 were dismissed for bad conduct. The figures are significant, as tending to show that, in spite of the shortened term of engagement and the increased pay, the Mounted Police was unable to obtain and retain desirable men. In my opinion, a great mistake was made. The engagement should have remained at 5 years, and additional pay should have been given to bring the total wage up to the market level. As it has turned out, the Government took away with one hand what it gave with the other. That it increased the pay is true, but it took away from the issue of kit, and the price of some of the articles of clothing has been raised to a prejudicial extent. Canadians as a whole are very proud of the world-wide reputation which the Force has made, but they may as well face the unquestionable fact that the Force is now on the downgrade and should be abolished before its reputation is quite gone. 5 years were none too long a time to teach a constable the multifarious duties of a mounted policeman, but when, in addition to the reduced term of 3 years, there is the added pestilential discharge by purchase whenever a man chooses to ask for it, it necessarily follows that the Force is able to render to the public nothing better than a very inferior kind of eye service. As an illustration of what I mean, a constable who had joined the Force on August 12, 1912, was in course of time transferred to my division, and was subsequently detailed for detachment duty at Bankhead, where there is an anthracite mine. He was by way of being a handy man, and the manager offered him $2.90 per day to run an engine in the mine. He applied to purchase, was given instant permission to do so, and on December 1st, 1913, took his discharge upon payment of $61.50, that is, $3 per month for the unexpired portion of his engagement. Another constable was sent to replace him at Bankhead, and on February 5th, 1914, he too applied for permission to purchase, which was instantly allowed by the Commissioner, and he took his discharge upon payment of $85.50. It seems that a surveyor had offered him $45 a month to join his survey party. To an officer in charge of a police district, such eccentricities as these are simply maddening and heartbreaking, and the public suffer as a result. The worst case known to me happened in the early part of 1914. There was a constable on detached duty at , but he was so utterly neglectful of his duties that I was in process of making arrangements to withdraw and replace him. To my intense astonishment, I received a telegram from the Commissioner's office at Regina to give him his discharge by purchase. This order had, I subsequently learned, emanated from Ottawa, and, of course, governed both the Commissioner and myself, but any such proceeding cannot fail to be subversive of discipline, and is antagonistic to the best interests of the Force. The people amongst whom I have lived and worked in the West for over 30 years will concede that I am as competent a judge of disciplinary administration as any person in Canada, and they will understand that I am telling them historical facts which they are likely to learn from no one but me, and which it is time they were told. This constable was given his discharge, and his successor, quite a competent young man, had hardly been in his place for 1 calendar month when he too applied to purchase, and was allowed to do so. From all the foregoing it will be seen that the Mounted Police Force has developed into a philanthropic organisation whose objects are laughable enough, so far as providing young men with means of livelihood is concerned, but hardly so satisfactory to the lonely settler when constabulary duties to be done. Nor is it possible to regard the philanthropic provision of openings for young men as the purpose for which a police force exists. To return, however, to the Commissioner's office in Regina, the muddle that most wanted straightening out was in connection with the medical staff. Whether rightly or wrongly, the Department at Ottawa had acquired the notion that the medical officers at the various divisional headquarter posts in different parts of the country were dispensing drugs, etc., supplied by the Government for the use of the non-commissioned officers and men in their private practice. Oddly enough, an officer could not get any medicine at the police surgery. In order to remedy this state of affairs, an oldish medical practitioner at St. Catharines in Ontario was persuaded by Sir John Macdonald to give up his practice there and bring his family to the North West, in order to take up the appointment of senior surgeon. All sorts of promises had been held out to induce him to take this step, and the old man used to complain bitterly that faith had not been kept with him. However that may have been, and I have no personal knowledge of the matter, the appointment was not in any way acceptable to the various assistant surgeons, who seemed determined to do all they could to make Dr. Jukes's life a burden. Correspondence used to be carried on directly between the medical officers, and if the senior surgeon wanted any information or returns which were not quite palatable, the assistants frankly told him to go to the devil. As soon as I felt myself securely seated in my chair, I issued a general order to the effect that in future direct correspondence between the senior and assistant surgeons was to cease, and was to be carried on through the Commissioner's office and the officers commanding divisions, each of whom would be held responsible that information required by the senior surgeon was promptly and accurately rendered, and that replies to the correspondence were couched in proper terms. As soon as the order reached Ottawa, the Comptroller at once wrote me a private note saying, "General Order so and so settles the medical question," as of course it did in a very obvious and simple manner, and there was no more trouble. Dr. Jukes became a great friend of mine, and was a very fine old gentleman, and also a very competent practitioner. The Conservative party treated him abominably. When, in course of time, his memory failed and he became past work, they laid him on the shelf with a paltry superannuation of about $25 per month. There was a clause in the Act whereby he could have been allowed to count 10 more years than he had actually served, but therein lies the difference between the two political parties. The Liberals looked after their friends, while the Conservatives do not. Take my own case. When Sir John Macdonald's party met disaster at the polls in 1896, I was not mean enough to leave it at a time when it most needed loyalty and service, as so many of the old chieftains' appointees did, but remained in its ranks until the Liberals went out of power in September 1911 over the reciprocity question. At that time both the Commissioner and the Assistant Commissioner were men who had been appointed by Sir John, but after that fateful 1895 election they had turned their coats and had thus secured promotion over the heads of their seniors. In 1913 a new appointment was made, that of an Assistant Commissioner for the province of Alberta, and I was by 8 years the senior superintendent of the force. I naturally expected to obtain the appointment. The whole western country had the same expectation, but I reckoned without my host. One of the superintendents had a brother in the Dominion Parliament, representing an Ontario constituency, and conceived the brilliant idea of obtaining promotion for himself over the heads of his seniors and betters. His amiable design in some way became known to another superintendent, senior to himself, and a scion of an old Quebec family. In self-protection, for I do the man justice to believe that he would never have done so otherwise, he set to work to pull political strings, with the result that he got the appointment. All such trickery as this is quite comme il faut in Canada. No one thinks any worse of a man for trying to supersede his superior, and it is this spirit which accounts for the numerous changes which have taken place in the past 30 years in the general officers sent to Canada from England to command the militia. The two officers at the head of the Mounted Police of whom I have spoken are graduates of the Royal Military College at Kingston, Ontario, and Britishers do not sufficiently assimilate the principle that Canada is for the Canadians, and that when a Canadian wants a job no Englishman need apply. When General Colin Mackenzie could not "get on" with the impossible Minister of Militia, whom most of his party take as a joke, nothing more needs to be said. Sir George French brought the Mounted Police into the West in 1873, and his treatment by the Canadian Government of the day is a matter of history. As a comment on the injustice with which he was treated by the Canadians, the Home Government gave him the Queensland command. End of chapter 1.